Hello and welcome everyone to our interview workshop and for joining us tonight. Tonight's conversation will center on part of the college admissions process that's not required, but at Hamilton we value its benefit for both students and in our review. We're going to be talking about the interview. At Hamilton, relationships matter, and one of the best ways to explore your potential fit with Hamilton is through an interview. My name is Jack Nivison. I'm a Senior Assistant Dean of Admission at Hamilton College. I'm joined with a colleague tonight and with three of our senior admission fellows to share some tips and advice pertaining to the college interview. In this panel, we will review what we find to be the benefits of doing an interview during the college process, some tips and advice we have for interviewees, some standard questions, and more. If you have any questions about interviews you would like answered, please feel welcome to add these in the chat. We would love to hear from you and answer as many as we can. Now I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves, starting with my colleague, Ben.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Rose. I'm an Associate Dean of Admission at Hamilton. I'm also a Class of '09 graduate. I was a creative writing major, and I double minored in history and classical studies, and I'm originally from Maine.
Great, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Calixto. I am from the Class of '21. My major is in geoscience. My minor is in Japanese. I'm originally from the Bronx in New York City. And some things I do on campus, aside from admissions, I'm also a lead consultant at the Oral Communication Center. And I'm also a part of La Vanguardia and QSU, which are two cultural clubs here on campus.
Hi, I'm Katie Gagnon. I am a senior. I am an econ and government double major. I'm from Glastonbury, Connecticut. And some things that I do on campus, I'm the captain of the dance team. I'm involved in Greek life. I'm also part of Flute Ensemble and the Philanthropy Committee.
Hi, everyone. My name's Lynn. I'm also a senior. I'm a creative writing major and a Hispanic studies minor. I'm from Los Angeles. And some things I do on campus, I'm a digital media intern. I write for the Hamilton website, and I'm one of the editors of our fashion magazine.
Great. Awesome. Thank you very much for those introductions. I will say, like Ben, I'm also from Maine. So we have two Mainers here tonight. But we're going to get started and just kind of talk about, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is the benefits of an interview. So Ben, can you talk to us about the benefits of an interview as part of the college admission process?
Sure. I mean, at its core, an interview is a conversation. I think a lot of the benefits come down to that you're chatting one-on-one with another person. Interviews can be evaluative or informative or both. Evaluative interviews are usually about trying to assess the person who is being interviewed. Informative interviews are about trying to impart information to that person. At Hamilton, ours is both. And so it really is about that conversation, trying to learn more about the person who's interviewing with us so we can evaluate them better in the application process, get to know them a little bit, especially get to know things that might not otherwise be obvious from other parts of the application, or kind of allow a student to tell us their story in a way that they'd like us to know it. But also an opportunity to have a back and forth about things they want to know about Hamilton, or questions they have about our own stories and how we ended up at Hamilton. Again, it really, in best case scenario, is a give and take, is something where we're both getting something out of that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, some of the things you talked about, that give and take, I think is really important. And I think that's something that our senior fellows who are with us tonight really do appreciate as well. So Lynn, can you talk to us, as your role as a senior fellow, can you talk to us about, what you think about the purpose of an interview is?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would echo what Ben was saying. Definitely, I think an interview is a great chance, I think, for us to get to know a student beyond just who they are on paper. So we actually get a feel for their personality and who they are, and we get to see them talk about what they're passionate about, anything like that, and get a better sense of them in terms of their fit at Hamilton, and also giving them an opportunity to learn more about Hamilton. So whether they they can come with any questions they have and get to know more about our community. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really reciprocal kind of. I kind of describe them as mutually beneficial experiences when I'm talking about them with students. And we have admission officers here, we have senior fellows here. So I think that one of the questions that usually comes up is who does an interview? And I think that it's really different from institution to institution, from college to college. I can tell you what we do at Hamilton and kind of share that how that might work at other colleges. So our admission interviews are primarily done by either admission officers like Ben and me, or by senior admission fellows like Katie, Lynn, and Christian that we have here today. These interviews, like Ben said, they're evaluative and informative. We also, in the past, have had alumni interviews, some of our alumni conducting interviews for us and providing that feedback for us. And I think that, those interviews, a lot of institutions do only alumni interviews or do a pretty large majority of their interviews through alumni. This year, we are not doing alumni interviews, but we have in the past. And so those are some of the people that you might end up talking with as part of your admission interview. I think the main thing to remember is that they're all friendly. They're all really friendly people. They're there because they want to learn, they want to help you learn more about Hamilton or whatever institution that you're interviewing with, but also they're there to kind of assess your fit with the institution as well. Moving on to the next part of our session, I have on our website, actually, as part of what we try to help you with the admissions process, we have these set of interview tips. And I'm going to share my screen for a brief moment just to show you the page. And so you can see, we have these interview tips, and basically there are several that we're going to discuss here tonight. And so I'm not going to share my screen for long because we're going to go over all these. So you don't need to try and memorize these. This is available on our website. But just so you know that this is a reference, this is a resource that you can reference throughout the process. I will say also that these were written pre-pandemic. And so these are kind of geared more towards in-person interviews. So in terms of a confident handshake, kind of hard to do that over Zoom or a virtual meeting platform. And so you won't be doing that during a virtual interview. And so we will be sharing some tips that have to do with virtual interviews as well. And so I'm going to kind of start out with kind of the beginning of the interview. And I'm going to ask Katie to kind of go through one of the main points of an interview to remember is that it's not kind of a question and answer. It's more of a discussion. So Katie, can you talk about it, how it's a bit more of a discussion?
Yeah, of course. So as Jack was saying, an interview should not feel like a Q&A. We're trying to have a genuine conversation with you and get to know who you are as a person. So we'll start with easy questions like, how is it going? And also, provide a little insight about myself too, just so you understand who you're talking to. It's definitely not a one-way thing. And I really enjoy learning about what students are passionate about through their interviews. I always have a chance to learn something new. I love when I can walk away from an interview and kind of have learned more about them and have a good idea of what they're passionate about, not just what their favorite class is with no explanation or anything like that.
Yeah, and in these interview questions, they might start out with, there might be some questions that make students think a little bit more throughout the interview, but that's not, not the way that I think we start our interviews most often. It's, it's like chit chat. It's how's your day going today? Or or if they were coming to campus, how is your journey to campus? Or if it's virtually, you might be asking how your class is going today. And so we're not going to be starting with the really introspective questions, if there are those in the interview at the beginning. So you don't have to worry about that at the beginning, I don't think. In terms of another one of our tips is about preparation. And preparing doesn't mean that you need to know everything about Hamilton or everything about the school that you're interviewing with. It honestly just means self-preparation of thinking about some questions that you might get asked, thinking about your interests, what are some of your favorite classes? What have you enjoyed in high school? What are you looking for in a college? What do you do outside the classroom? Like Katie said, we want to know all these things. And so just kind of thinking ahead and preparing your answers for that. There's some answers, some students come prepared but might be a little nervous, so we might have to ask a few follow-up questions. But sometimes students don't think of these answers or don't think about themselves and what they want to talk about beforehand. And so as kind of a demonstration of how that can go a little poorly, we're going to have Christian and Lynn kind of do a little demonstration here. So Christian is going to be Christian and Katie are going to be doing this. And I got my names mixed up for the next part, but Christian is going to be interviewing Katie, and Katie's going to be showing how she might not have been as prepared as she could be for this interview. So take it away, Christian.
Awesome. So Katie, I guess I'm curious to know a little bit about what your favorite class is and why.
I like math.
Oh,
I guess I like the time of day is good for it.
Oh yeah, of course. That's great. Any other reason why? Did it help you like think a little stronger? Like did it help you think a
I
little
mean,
different?
every class makes me think. I guess I like math. I like numbers.
Mm, of course, of course.
Yeah, so you can kind of see there that like the information that Katie gave was helpful, but like we now know that she likes math, but we didn't really get anything more from that. Like we might have been able to gather this from like her transcript or from like some of her activities and such, but we didn't get a deeper understanding. So Katie, how do you think that you would respond if you were trying to give a little bit more in that answer?
So a better, maybe more detailed response would be, I think one of my favorite classes this year is my math class. I've always really enjoyed math, but this year particularly, I'm finding it really interesting. I'm really connected with my teacher and really appreciate how their teaching style matches with my learning style. And through this class, I've learned not only to think, more and learn more about math, but I've also learned a bit more about how I like to function as a student.
Right. Right. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to speak exactly as Katie did, like, but like, the substance was there. I think we can all kind of see the differences between how she answered Christian's questions first time and how she answered them the second time. So another part, one of our tips I want to have Lynn discuss next, and that's like, about, keeping it professional. Lynn, can you talk about what we mean by that, by keeping it professional?
Yeah, I mean, things definitely look a little bit different now over Zoom, but I think in terms of attire, we generally like to advise like keep it comfortable but still semi-professional. So like you don't need to wear a suit to your interview, but definitely like maybe not like sandals and shorts, just so like something you're comfortable in, but keep it professional, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that that extends from not only the attire but also the way that you approach the interview too, because like these are conversations, but you also want to take it seriously because like especially like whether it's informative or evaluative or both, this is part of the process, like and like we do take feedback from these interviews and put them into your application. So if you're maybe not taking it as seriously as you can or as you should, that's something that we'll take note in too. And like whether it's a little too lackadaisical or like just a little like a little bit more on those lines, like that's something we'll also take into account. Doesn't mean you need to be stiff in your interview. We want you to be yourself, and so if you're a little goofy, that's okay, but like there is a balance of those things too. Like Ben, I think Ben's going to go over the next tip with everybody.
Sure. So sometimes people ask us like, well, what do I have to do to have a good interview? Like, what does a good interview look like? And just like with the college essay, there's no one right way to do a good interview. I think we've all had a number of good interviews that didn't look necessarily like each other. It's really just about that communication, right? A good interview is one where we learned about you and you learned about us. That at the bottom line is what we want. And I mean, from what you just saw from Katie is the first answer she gave was not particularly detailed, right? Like you didn't actually learn much beyond the surface. Sometimes it's just that the person went a little bit beyond the surface, or after a follow-up question was willing to go a little bit beyond the surface and give us that extra perspective, that extra view into what really makes them tick. I mean, the benefit of an interview more than anything else is that we can ask those follow-up questions, right? We can get a little bit deeper and go a little bit past what a person looks like on paper. And that's what makes an interview a good one. Like I said, it's not about one particular way. There's lots of good ways to do an interview.
Yeah, I mean, Christian, this is a question that I kind of want to pose to you about like, the content of the interviews. Like sometimes students think, oh, like, what if my interviewer doesn't like the same things that I do or doesn't enjoy the same things, or what if are they going to look down upon me for some of the things that I enjoy? Is that the case with these interviews?
Oh, no, of course not. I think, honestly, I really enjoy having different perspectives. I think it's your ability to kind of like explain it and kind of explain why it's magical to you. It's very strong in of itself. So no, I would not necessarily say that we have to have the same interest at all. It's just your ability of explaining that really I look for at least.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's almost sometimes more fun when you don't have the same interest because like you said, like, I know I was an English and government major in college, but like, when someone starts talking to me about like, astronomy or math or something, I'm like, I don't really know much about what they're talking about, but I'm going to learn from them. I'm going to learn a little bit more. So maybe like, yes, they'll learn more about Hamilton from me, but I'm going to learn a little bit more about what they're interested in. So I can like talk about these things with other people too. So that's kind of fun as well. I mentioned like earlier, some of our tips, like, how, like, approach with a firm handshake on the website are geared more towards in-person interviews. But for virtual interviews, I think that there's also like, a certain amount of guidelines, like, that you should try and follow and try and aspire to and control the environment as much as you can. And recognize that not everyone can control some of these things, but as much as you can, I think the one thing you really can control is eye contact. Because like, we can tell if, you might be looking at something else on your screen when you're in a virtual interview, or maybe you're distracted by something, or maybe you don't want to exactly look us in the eye, even over the web. And so just trying to make as much eye contact as possible, I think, especially in a virtual setting, can really keep the interview going. One of the things you might not be able to control is the lighting in the room that you're in and the microphone. We recognize that not everyone has the ability to control, like, lighting. Maybe like, you're in a living room, or you're just in a very common space with other family or loved ones or friends. And so, or maybe you're in school and you're doing your interview. So you can only control as much as you can control. But when you can, I think that it's always best to trying to make sure that those connections that like, we try and make sure that we can hear you and vice versa. And I think that that's really important too. At the same time, maybe you might be able to have like, a virtual background or something. If you want to do that, that's fine. But if you had something like, that wouldn't necessarily work for you, or you don't think that would kind of take away from the interview for you, that's okay. But that's just another option that you could do in case you are in a busier space. But we recognize that technology, even in the year 2020, is not perfect. It's probably less than perfect a lot of the time. And so there are going to be technical issues that arise. So like, if your Zoom breaks down or your Wi-Fi goes out, these things are going to happen. And so like, the number one thing, and I'm going to let Christian talk about like, some of the things that could go wrong and what you might be able to do to help with those, is just not to panic is the number one thing. Like, just to realize like, we're not going to get mad. We're not going to get upset. Like, we recognize this happens to us almost as much as it happens to you too. So Christian, can you take the guests kind of through, the viewers kind of through what happens if something goes wrong when you're trying to do a virtual interview?
Yeah, of course. So like Jack said, internet is a funny place sometimes where, you have a little bit of mishaps that you have to work out. A really common one, for example, is where Wi-Fi kind of goes out. Sometimes your Wi-Fi goes fuzzy. The way you would kind of see it on ours is that like you would see like this little hourglass, pretty much hourglass looking thing, kind of saying that like there's no video person. But as long as you hold down tight, we should be able to sign, like the Wi-Fi should usually fix itself. Another really common is if we freeze, which is particularly funny because some people are in conversation, you're just like, and then you're kind of stuck there. But again, it's just a matter of making sure that, you stay calm, because, what's really helpful is we have ways to communicate. That is why we have the little phone numbers. So in case like, for some reason there's no link, or it just freezes completely, or Wi-Fi is just a hot mess, we would be able to call you and then figure out what's the best solution to move forward with.
Yeah. And like we have, like, when you register for an interview for Hamilton in particular, you'll get an email and also get a reminder email with the link that we use for our video format for our interviews. So if you're ever wondering, where is the link? It's right there. And if you don't see a link there, the easiest thing to do is just to contact us. Because like, we're sending that out thinking that you'll have it. And if for some reason you don't have it and your interview is 15 minutes away, we're not expecting you to try and figure it out on your own. Like, we're here to help you through with that too. And like, what Christian said about the freezing, we've all had instances where, we've asked a question and someone looks deep in thought, and then you realize after 10 seconds, they're not deep in thought anymore. They're just not there. So when that happens, like Christian said, we do have your phone numbers. We'll give you a call. You can also email us, call our office, and we'll try and get you back online.
Something to keep in mind too, technical issues are not your fault.
Yes.
Like, and we get that. So don't freak out that like, we're going to put demerits on your record or something.
Yeah.
Like we know this happens in this year of all years, right? When everyone's using technology all the time, that there's going to be problems. So don't freak out about it.
So like, we've kind of covered the tips that we have to share for you, and we'll probably share like, a lot more of advice throughout the rest of the time. Like, I want to say, if you have questions, like, continue to put those in the chat, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can if we don't answer them during this panel. But we want to talk about some examples of interview questions. Because I think that's a lot of questions, like a lot of the questions that I'll get, like, about interviews, like, what are you trying to figure out? Like, what do you want to know? What are some things you're going to ask? I mean, the example that I give of ones that I'm not going to ask, I got ones got asked in an interview, like, if you could be a vegetable, what kind of vegetable would you be? And I'm like, I don't eat vegetables, so I don't know. That's my answer. And so, like, we're not going to ask you things like that. Like, what we're going to ask you is like, things about academics, extracurriculars, college search, stuff about your personality. I just want to pose this to the group. Like, are there any particular questions that you like to ask of your interviewees?
Yeah, I have a kind of fun one that I like to ask sometimes, like usually towards the end. I like to ask if, like, what's your dream job? Like if like location, money, or any circumstances where like out of the question, like what would you want to do with your life? And I feel like I always get like really interesting answers, that one.
Yeah, that's a great one. It's like, you don't have to like totally stick to that, like, throughout the next like 4 years. It's just like, hey, what would you want to do? Yeah, that's a great one.
I've kind of one of my go-tos towards the end of an interview. It's a little bit of a deeper one, but I think it really helps me get a good idea of who someone is. I ask if there's anyone or anything that's been particularly influential in shaping who they are. And I think that I get a lot of really diverse answers from that, whether it be summer camp or a family member or just someone that's been really important in their life. And I think that really says a lot about someone and their values too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One question I really like asking is usually if somebody's into sports, I usually like asking students, like, what would your team say about you in a couple of sentences? Because I think it would show kind of like, your strengths and kind of like what you think you can bring to the table, which I always think is fun.
Yeah. And I think that you can extend that to the classroom too. Like, questions sometimes we ask are like, how would your classmates describe you, or how would your teachers describe you? And I think that, like, that team environment, like, it's all interconnected. Like, I think that's a really great question to ask too.
Yeah, one of my favorite academic questions is, what's your favorite like paper or project or presentation that you've given or that you found the most interesting? And I really love that question, not only to find out what they're interested in, but I always learn really cool facts too. So I love that.
Yeah, and sometimes it's like they might have said, like, that history was their favorite class or something they'd taken, and then they describe a science project that they did, and it's like, wow, okay, that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I do always like asking, what is your favorite thing you learned in X class? I think you always get something interesting out of that. And one of the things we're hoping to get is, what are you passionate about? And if you enjoyed learning about it, you're probably pretty passionate about it. So we can learn some very interesting things from that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I always ask, like, everyone knows, I mean, that is a Lion King poster behind me. So I'm a big movie fan. So I'm always asking, what's your favorite movie? Like, if you had a favorite movie, what would it be? And I recognize that not everyone likes movies. So sometimes they'll say, like, what's your favorite book? Or like, what's your favorite television show or musical artist or something? And I think that gives some really interesting answers, because, like, they might be talking all this academic stuff and all the stuff they're doing outside the classroom. Then they just surprise you with an answer. And you're like, wow, that's a really cool. And it's like totally different for everybody too. So I think, like, we've kind of covered, like, the rundown of, like, the types of questions that we ask. Like, we also will ask about the college search. Like, we're not going to ask you, like, where else are you visiting? Like, we're going to be asking you, like, how, I think one thing that I usually ask, and I think a lot of people ask, just how are you doing? Like, how are you going through this? Because we want to try and support you. And we recognize that it can be, for some people, it could be stressful. Some people will be like, it's so much fun. It's so exciting. And for a lot of people, it's kind of a combination of both. But we just want to, like, see, like, how we can help you through that process too. I think that we want to do a little mini demonstration with this again. And so we're actually going to have Lynn interview Christian and just give an example, some example, and like kind of go back and forth for a couple of questions, like, about what type of, like, academic questions you might ask Christian, and Christian can respond as he would.
Yeah, Christian, well,
Yeah.
To start off, could you tell me a little bit about your high school? Do you like the school? Tell me a little bit about the community.
Yeah, of course. My high school is actually in the South Bronx. It is a fairly small school for it being in the city, about 500 kids. I have had the lovely opportunity to, for this year in particular, I'm going to be taking AP Literature, which is really exciting. I'm also going to be in AP US, and I made it to pre-calculus. I'm very excited because I'm also taking physics. So I'm assuming that they're going to marry really well, and I'm excited for this semester.
Super exciting. Is there a particular subject that you've particularly been drawn towards?
Ooh, I am very excited to continue APUSH. The reason why is because last year, my teacher was actually, my former teacher is going to continue teaching. And I'm really excited because she is really good with coming up with really creative projects. And I really like debating. And so I'm excited because next week we're going to do this debate on World War II to see who is to blame for the cause of World War II. I'm very excited for the presentation.
Awesome. Yeah, we could go on forever, Christian.
Go on forever, yeah. Yeah, I mean, hey, I want to hear more about that discussion, Christians. But yeah, no, so you can kind of see, like, you know, it's not necessarily tough questions that we're asking. It's just like, you know, but it does, I think, going back to that preparation thing, it does help for you to give a little bit of thought about, like, you know, your time in high school and what you want us to know about. Sometimes a question that we get is like, you know, whether we're doing, like, you know, meeting with students virtually at their high school or in person at their high school in previous years, or just getting, you know, receiving emails, is should I interview, like, you know? And so Ben, like, you know, can you tell us about, like, you know, what you would usually say to a question like that? Like, should, like, you know, if I asked you, should I interview?
I mean, that is a personal decision, right? Like in general, I think interviews are usually helpful, but it depends on the person. Being nervous in an interview does not make something a bad interview. So just because you would think you'll be nervous in an interview doesn't mean like, oh goodness, I should not interview ever. That's kind of a normal response. Lots of people are nervous in interviews. It's more like, you know, if you think you'll be just completely uncomfortable, unable to have that communication with a stranger, like we get that it's not for everyone. Mm-hmm. There are other methods you can use to try and show schools your personality yourself if you're totally just not comfortable with an interview. But really, interviews, most of the time, they are a very good way for us to get a sense of a student. And that can, like I said, be very valuable for us in the admission process when we're really trying to see the fit. We're trying to say, you know, how can this person fit into Hamilton, and also communicate back to the student the ways they could fit into Hamilton based on their questions. Mm-hmm. A good interview is not going to single-handedly admit a student, but it can definitely give us a much more well-rounded perspective on them, and sometimes give us a different perspective than something we're getting elsewhere in the application. Because again, that's a conversation, and you can ask those follow-up questions and really get to the heart of things that way.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that sometimes people will ask also, like, you know, what makes an interview maybe bad or not as good? And I think that we've all seen some things that, like, and I think Ben just gave a great example, like, you know, just because someone's nervous or is a little shy, that doesn't make that interview bad at all. Like, you know, that happens. Like, you know, I'm pretty sure, like, you know, when I did my college interview, I was very shy and I was pretty nervous too. But like, you know, I think that sometimes, as I said, one of the things that we sometimes will see is that, you know, you don't have to know everything about Hamilton or be particularly knowledgeable about Hamilton, but, like, you know, the disinterest in Hamilton, or this could go for any kind of institution that you're interviewing with, or if you're told, like, you know, your parent made you do this, or someone else, X person made you do this, that's not typically something that we want to see. Like, you know, that's probably something we'll take note about, that they weren't as invested in this as possible. There's also, you know, we are a small liberal arts college, and maybe they mentioned something that we don't have, like, you know, a program, or maybe they're saying, I'm really looking for, like, you know, a big school around 10,000 students or more. Given that we have a little over 1,800 students, this might not be the place for them. And so that might just show maybe they haven't done their research, or maybe they haven't really checked us out that much. Also, they might disclose an issue that might be of concern to the community. Maybe they said something like, you know, that might be a little bit of concern. Or, you know, going back to, you know, keeping it professional but loose. Sometimes students err a little bit more on the loose side and maybe don't take it nearly as seriously as they should. Maybe they ask inappropriate questions or use profanity. I think it's just a given never to use profanity in an interview. And, like, you know, so those are some of the things that might make an interview stand out in a more negative way. But we don't want to end this section on the negative. We want to kind of query the panelists about, like, you know, what are some of your favorite examples of interviews that you've had so far? Lynn, do you have an example that comes to the top of your head?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, multiple come to mind, but I think the best interviews I've had are ones where I really just get to know the person super well, and I, like, understand what they're passionate about, and I see them, like, get excited about it. So, like, recently I had one where this student just talked a lot about their passion for literature and philosophy, and gave me so many, like, would run down all of these, like, stories and tell me all of this stuff that was just super interesting. And we ended up talking about, like, the existence of God and what makes literature literature. And it was just, like, really interesting and exciting. And that just really stuck with me.
That sounds amazing. That sounds great. Katie, do you have an example?
Yeah, again, like Lynn, tons come to mind, but I think a good theme of it is when I leave the interview being like, wow, I could have a conversation with them for, like, several more hours and I know what I could talk to them about. I think something that really stands out to me is when an interview is able to kind of connect their own interests in a way. So I had someone talk to me about how their interests in literature and theater connected, and how with theater you kind of get that additional role of like the audience perspective, and just how they kind of interpret when they are doing English projects and how that kind of relates to their then extracurricular interests, or if something that's an academic interest is also something they're able to volunteer through, and they kind of connect that. It really shows me that they're truly passionate about that. And I've had a lot of those examples where I'm like, wow, like I think we could be friends, and just keep this conversation going beyond the interview, which is really cool.
Yeah, the clock kind of disappears in some of those interviews.
Yeah.
And I don't think we mentioned before, but like, for Hamilton, interviews are typically around 30 minutes. But sometimes they can last for longer than that, like, especially like, if we kind of lose track of time and we're just kind of caught up in the conversation. Christian, do you have an example?
Yeah, I personally really enjoy hearing students, like everyone kind of said, like really connecting what their passions are and how like they can bring it to college, I think is a really good thing. I think something that I really personally enjoy is when a student tells me that they, if they like felt that they struggled in a course, kind of like how they were able to grow out of it and what steps they took. Because it's just really interesting to hear the different perspectives students take to really, take that step forward, because, things can be a little difficult sometimes. So it's really nice to hear when students really explain how they're able to like work through a situation and kind of like really get to the next step. I personally really enjoy hearing those.
Yeah, like seeing the growth that they've been able to have through high school.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. Ben, does an example come to mind for you?
I've been doing this a lot longer. So it's funny. I was thinking about, I've had so many really good interviews. Part of the problem is that it is way more common to have a good interview than a bad one. And so it's just, there's so many examples of them. I would reiterate that the students who really are able to communicate their passions, like those always really stick out, particularly when we end up off on some interesting tangent. I think I'm very much into history podcasts. I've had several really fulfilling conversations with students about the history podcasts that they like and the ones I like and so on. And again, it's an opportunity to get a sense of their personality and to connect on some level.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of like the same way, like, kind of reiterating what everyone said. Like, I remember I love seeing like an interview about something that like I'm talking with a student and they tell me about something that they really enjoy. And for this student, it was woodworking. And he like kind of like, mentioned it, but then we started, like Ben said, we kind of went off on this tangent for a while. And then he ended up like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, I don't know why I talked about that for so long. And then like, don't apologize. Like, it's like those tangents are wonderful. They're really telling, I think. And then when we read his application later, like he mentioned it in his application, but that interview really brought it out more. And so it's something we couldn't tell at the time, but like it really helped inform the application that much more. And I mean, as I said, I ask everyone what their favorite movies are. And I think one of my favorite things that ever happened was I had 2 interviews, like one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and they're both from different parts of the country. And they both said the same favorite movie and they didn't know each other. And it was Mary Poppins. And I was like, okay, that's really cool. And it was just kind of a funny thing that happened. So, but yeah, I totally agree. Like, when people are able to talk about their interests and like, not like, just like be themselves and not just like, there are times where maybe like, we might be able to tell that someone's just saying this because they think that this is something that we want to hear. But when you hear someone talking about something that they're saying it because they believe it, like, I think that genuine enthusiasm really does come through. So I think that we've kind of, in a way, like, throughout this presentation so far, kind of created like almost a checklist. And so I'm just going to run down like, the checklist that we've kind of created, like, to kind of like, so some questions you should ask, like, before, maybe during, and then after your interview. I mean, have you researched a little bit about the school that you're interviewing with? Do you have your confirmation? We talked about that. Check your email. That's where most of those things are going to be. Have you practiced eye contact and being alert? Maybe don't have any other screens open when you have your interview going. Are you dressed professionally to a certain extent? Is the information I'm sharing important to me? And am I being myself? I think that's a lot of what we just talked about. And those are good examples of good interviews. Am I able to express interest in this institution? Have I prepared questions for the interviewer? I always say, like, when I mentioned that it's a mutually beneficial experience, we obviously ask you questions, find out a little bit more whether you're a good fit for us, but you can also take that time to ask us questions and see a little bit more whether we as an institution are a good fit for you. Do I have the contact information for my interviewer? so that I could potentially send a thank you note afterwards. And so that's the last question is, have I sent a thank you note? It's like, that gratitude, it definitely means a lot. Like, I love getting thank you notes, whether they're emails or in person. Like, they can really brighten days, I think, as they can in other respects. So I think that that's all the information that we wanted to set out to give you at first, but I know that there are many questions that you've asked in the chat. So thank you. Keep on asking those. A question that we got, Ben, that I'm going to pose to you, is we get this question quite a lot. Should we interview before or after we submit the application?
Yeah, that is a common question. This is actually one that will vary quite a bit from school to school. Some schools will actually not allow you to interview before you submit an application. Some schools will only allow you to interview before you submit the application. At Hamilton, it's more of like a year thing. We start interviewing juniors in the February of their junior year, and then we will continue interviewing them through the January of their senior year. So if you've applied before or after your interview, it doesn't really matter as long as you're in that time span. The one caveat I'll put in is that there are certain points when we're making admission decisions and we need to have had an interview before then. So if you're applying early decision, your deadlines are going to be a little bit different. But for us, at least, the short answer is it doesn't actually matter whether you've interviewed before or after you actually hit submit on your application.
Yeah. That's a great segue into another question that was asked, which is, when in the year do interviews usually take place? And the short answer is, for our purposes, interviews take place all year. But in terms of our applicants, we start offering interviews for juniors during spring of their junior year. And then we'll offer interviews for rising seniors and seniors through the fall and probably into January of their senior year. But we do have a cutoff date, as Ben said, because we're making decisions. We need to have these interviews done so that we can include this information in your application. And so we will stop our interviews towards the end of January for seniors, but then they start up again for juniors. And so whether you interview as a junior or as a rising senior over the summer or in senior fall or January, that's up to you. Like, that is a personal decision and there's no right or wrong way. It's just, when do you feel like it's a good time and a good fit for you to do this?
And it really does depend on the school. But this is not something where there's some like general consensus. Most schools do it this one way. There really isn't. It varies pretty widely. So you just need to check with the schools.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ben, another question that we're getting. Sorry, senior fellows. These are a bit about the admissions process a little bit. But what do we look for in Hamilton applicants?
All right, that's a big question.
It's a very macro question that we're going.
Yeah, so I think big picture, we're always looking for people who are going to succeed academically and who are going to be a good fit. And when you come down to it, everything kind of fits into those categories. Of course, we are a school. We want our students are going to succeed academically, but we have a really great, tightly knit community on campus, and so that's why fit is really important to us. Mm-hmm. And honestly, the interview fits a little bit in both, because you can talk to us about your academic interests, and that can inform a little bit what kind of a student you are, but it is especially helpful for getting that sense of fit of, is this someone that we can see on campus? Is this somebody who's going to bring their passions to this community? Is this someone, in admissions, we're inviting people into this community. And so is this someone we want to invite into the community? We think is going to really take advantage of what Hamilton has to offer. And so that, the interview, like I said, it's not going to get you in on your own, but it can be a really nice complement to the other stuff we get in the application.
Yeah, I think that, use that word, it's a nice compliment. I'm actually gonna say that your answer is a nice compliment to the next question I had, which is, how important are the interviews? And I think that you've really said it really well. It's not gonna not gonna put someone over, get them admitted, but it can really complement an application well. And I think that example that I gave about the student who was interested in woodworking, maybe we would have known that from the application, but we probably wouldn't have known it as deeply as we did from that information we got from that interview. This is a question I'm going to pose to the senior fellows, and I'll start with I'll start with Katie. Is it appropriate to ask the interviewers questions? If yes, to which extent? How many questions should they ask you if they should ask you questions?
Yeah, of course, ask questions. That's part of why we're here, is for you to learn more about Hamilton. Also, if you're going to hear our experience too, if you're talking to a senior fellow, we've all been going to Hamilton, which can be nice. I think it's really useful to ask questions that help you envision yourself on Hamilton's campus or wherever you're interviewing. And I would just, to what extent, I would stray away from super personal questions, as we kind of talked about earlier, but it's definitely appropriate to ask, and how could I be involved in music on Hamilton's campus? Or, what has been one of your favorite experiences in a course or something like that, that really would help you understand the school more too for your own benefit too.
Yeah. Yeah. Lynn, like, a question we got was like, what are some good questions to ask an interviewer? Katie gave some examples, but I think I would just like kind of change this question. Like, are there any questions outside of the really personal ones that you would maybe lean not towards, or like maybe lean more towards, so what are some good questions to ask an interviewer?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I feel like Katie answered that pretty well. I think it really depends. There is no like good question you can ask us. It really depends on who you are and what you want to actually know about Hamilton. So I would say I get this question a lot about like what like who is the Hamilton student and things like that. And those can be good questions, and definitely ask them if you're curious. But I would say the like most insightful questions I think are ones that probably personally are relevant to you specifically. So like if you're interested in a particular like area of study, then asking about that, or interested in a particular activity, like you can ask about how you might be able to get involved with that at Hamilton. So things that really interest you are going to be the best questions, I think.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect answer. Like, the good questions are the questions you want to know. Like, are the questions that you really want to know, because, and that's my piece of advice always, is to say like, my piece of advice for you during this process is ask questions. Like, you never know, you might not know unless you ask. Like, there's a lot of stuff on the website, but even if it is on a website, we can direct you kind of towards where that is. And interviewers don't know everything about Hamilton or everything about the admissions process necessarily. There might be some questions that we have to check up on, but we can check up on those things for you and stay in contact with you throughout the process. I mean, one of the questions actually was, how would you go about getting the information of your interviewer to send a thank you note? Christian, can you tell us a little bit about like, what we do to make sure that we have that, students have that information?
Yeah, of course. I personally always make sure that they have it. I always make sure that after our interview, I will provide my email, which is where students can usually send me the thank you note. If not, there's always the address of the student house, which is in Hamilton, and that's the admissions building, where you can also send, if like you want to do like the physical ones, you can send it to the student house through Hamilton. But normally I think, given the whole situation with internet and we're doing this all virtually, I go with I'd say email is probably the easiest way to do it.
Yeah.
If you lose an email to, basically every admission office has a generic admission officer address, and you should always feel free to send something to that and say, could you please make sure it gets to XYZ person?
Yeah. I think that, and like, and also all of the admission officer emails are on the website as well. So if you want to reach out, even if this person, like if Ben or I are your admission officer and we didn't interview you, but you want to reach out to us, you can also reach out to us and say like, I interviewed with someone named Christian. Could you give us his email address? Like, I somehow lost it. We can just provide you with his email address and any of the email addresses of the senior fellows too. Another question, I think this might be one of the last ones we have. I'm going to pose this to the group because this is a very pertinent question for what we're doing right now. How would you recommend that we get to know people over Zoom when we're stuck within the confines of this box on a screen and don't have necessarily body language cues or can't pick up on things as well in like as we could in an in-person thing? How do we overcome this kind of in a way virtual barrier in that way? Or do you have any tips or any piece of advice that you'd give them?
This is an extremely philosophical question that I feel like everybody is grappling with everywhere right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that for me, just the engagement piece, I think is the most important thing, because I think that basically if you wouldn't do it in an in-person interview, I wouldn't do it in a virtual interview. So like, I said, maybe like, you took some notes, you prepped some stuff. I wouldn't have that open the whole time. I mean, sometimes when we're in person, people will take out like notes that they wrote down for questions and stuff. I think that's fine. But during the interview, trying to maintain as much of that engagement as possible. And whether that's eye contact or whether that's just like, not making it a question and answer, kind of making it more of a conversation like we kind of do. I think that that's one of the most important things you can do.
Yeah, I would say also, as we talked about eye contact, also I still talk with my hands on Zoom. And I think that that's kind of a fun way to show excitement. Also, I would like to just a fun story. Sometimes you can learn a lot about someone because of Zoom. Like there is a girl I was interviewing, and in like her background, because like in her room, she had all these like models she had built, and that was something we could then talk about. So sometimes it's kind of fun to learn about people like through their environment. So there is positives, of course, too.
Absolutely. Like, you know, I think that there was a one kind of like last question that we'll get to before we wrap up. And this is kind of like a lighter question. Is it okay, like, you know, to have a fidget toy or to fidget in general, like, you know, in these interviews? And my personal is yes, like, you know, if that makes you more comfortable in an interview, like, you know, or if you're nervous and you might fidget, I mean, that's okay. I mean, we're not going to judge you on any of those things. I think that that's a really important thing to note, is like, you know, we're not going to judge you if you're nervous or anything along those lines. I mean, I think the rest of the group would agree on that one, right?
Yeah, these are weird times. Like we know this is weird and uncomfortable, and we're all nervous, and we're just trying our best. Like it's totally fine.
Whatever you need to get you through, like, you know, this process, like, you know, if it's helpful for you, it's helpful for us. So, like, you know, that's a great question, and I'm sure it's a question that a lot of people might have, like, you know, about this. But thank you very much for joining us. I think that that's all the time that we have. We will continue to have virtual events throughout the fall. So if you'd like to keep up with them, please visit our Discover page. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all the people who tuned in. We hope you all stay safe and healthy, and have a great night. Thank you very much.
Bye.